We're going to look at the last week of Jesus' life. This past week, we've done that last week. But what we're going to do today is we're going to look at before he ascends, before he leaves. Now, anytime you get ready to go somewhere, there's certain things that you do, I would imagine. For me, I'm always checking my pockets. Okay, I got my keys. Okay, making sure the keys aren't separated between house and car and all that. Making sure I have those things. Got my wallet. Okay. And everything that in the car that needs to be in the car. I look at all those things, and then one of the things I do is make sure all the lights are turned off. I don't iron, so I don't have to worry about that part. The iron turned off. Some people, my mom would always say, did I turn the iron off? Well, I don't have to worry about that. So there's certain things that you just do. Some people, they make sure they drink all the milk before they leave. And, there's certain things that you're gonna end up doing. Now, if to get right with people, there's certain things you're going to do. You think about certain things that haven't been said. You think about certain things that you wish you could have said. Certain things that just time has just gotten in the way, and you kind of push those things down. But there's things that need to be said nonetheless. We've talked about from Jesus when he came in on Sunday, that morning when historically they would try to figure out and they would pick the Passover lamb. You've got the real Passover lamb coming into town. And then we've looked at through that whole week all the activities that he did. He's doing all these things. It said early in the morning he'd get up and he'd leave to go to the temple, and at night he'd go back to the Mount of Olives, and they'd basically camp out all week long. And he's got some things that he's got to get ready before he leaves. He's having all these moments said. And as he's talking to the disciples and he's talking to the apostles, he has these last moments that he's talking about. And after that Sunday that we talked about last Sunday, the Sunday that changes everything before and after, the one where he rose, he sacrificed and came back from the dead. As we talked about 1 Corinthians chapter 15, "O death, where is your sting?" There is no more sting because he's the one that's removed death. Now we can live forever. We'll die physically, but not spiritually. And so we have this opportunity. And so he comes back and he lives on this earth for 40 days. We talked last week about the appearances that he made that Sunday. Well, today we're going to talk about the appearance that he makes in John chapter 21, just to 7 people, 7 disciples that he's going to be talking to. And as you turn to John 21, there's certain things that he needs to do. Certain things that he needs to say before he leaves. You think about those difficult conversations that you need to have. I know that it seems like here lately, every week, I've got a difficult decision, or not a difficult decision, but a difficult conversation that happens in my office on a regular basis. And they don't ever get any easier. But it's nonetheless something that has to take place. And the conversation he's going to have today is going to be something that has to take place there on that shore. And you see, this right here, this is going to be, it talks about in verse 1, it says the Sea of Tiberias. This is the same as if you talked about it in Luke chapter 5 when it says the Lake of Gennesaret. And it's also the same as you would say the Sea of Galilee. It's all the same area. So something that we're probably more familiar with is the Sea of Galilee. So this takes place there. It just has different names. And so that's the setting, the Sea of Galilee. And a lot of things have taken place there through the years at the Sea of Galilee. But this is going to be, if you have your outline, this is going to be a night of defeat. You ever have those nights that they seem like the hits keep coming? It seems like that probably on most Mondays for folks. Oh man, why'd I even get out of bed? You've had those days, right? It just one thing happens after another. Well, in verse 2, you have Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, you have the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples that are with them. So you have the 7. These are 7 men here. And these 7 Peter says in verse 3, I'm going fishing. And sometimes after you just had enough, I'm going fishing. To me, it kind of gives me the idea that maybe he's going fishing because of where he is spiritually. He's seen Jesus resurrect. He saw him that Sunday night that we talked about. But just because you see someone, you spend a little time with them, doesn't mean you're right with them. And here, he says he's going fishing, and it doesn't say in the text, it's just the way my mind thinks. My mind thinks about those 3.5 years he invested with Jesus, and it was all of a sudden just nothing. Because he says in Mark chapter 14, 29, Peter said to them, even though they all fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly, I tell you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. And he says emphatically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And we know the story. He denies him 3 times, don't we? And so here's a man who, I'll stake my whole life on it. There's no way I'm denying you. And it happened 3 times. In the book of Luke, it says that 3rd time, Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. The 3rd time that Peter was denying him. Just painful. So here, this to me just seems like, it's one of those things where I don't know what I'm good at. I guess I'll go back to what I was just doing before. I used to be a fisherman. Let's just go back to that. At least I could catch some fish here and there. I was making a living. At least in my mind, he's spiritually just kind of throwing in the towel. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. But I do know that this night was not a successful night. This would have been a very difficult night because he says, I'm going fishing. And they say, hey, we'll go with you. Because who doesn't want to do that? Lloyd says he's going fishing. My dad says, yeah, I'll go with you. He's not even invited, but he's going with him. And so he says, they say, I'll go with you. So all 7, they get in this. And it says, they got out into the boat. But that night, they caught nothing. So you're talking about some frustration. If you want to know what it's like to go all night long and not catch a fish, you need to put your feet in my shoes. Because if I go fishing and you come with me, you're not catching anything. We don't go catching, we go fishing when you're with me. And so I can imagine that night, that whole night they're out there. They caught nothing. So right here, they had the future of, let's go and we're going to get some. They had the idea of what the future is going to behold. I imagine, we're going to get some fish. We're going to have a cookout. It's going to be great. Well, future, all of a sudden, it's a setback. That'd be the point after the night of defeat. They had this future planned out, and all of a sudden now there's a setback. So future to setback, it seems like we do that a lot ourselves. We have this idea in our mind of how life is going to be, and then all of a sudden we have one setback, one set after another that happens in our life. And what are we going to do with those setbacks? Well, that's what really is the picture, because we're all going to have them. And I know a lot of you, I know some of the setbacks you're facing. I know some setbacks are physical. I know some setbacks are emotional. I know some setbacks are spiritual. And physical, emotional, hopefully I got all those in. But you're just going through setbacks. And sometimes it feels like we just want to kind of take a break and we want to go fishing. Instead of fishing for men, we just want to fish for fish. Things that the physical things don't matter, instead of focus on the spiritual things. And so you have this night of defeat, future to setback. And then all of a sudden, the next point, there's a morning of decision. Because this is going to be a different morning. In verse 4, it says, just as the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. But they didn't recognize him. And the reason why is because he is a long way off. It talks about him being about 100 yards away. So you think about, that's a football field. And you may be having some waves in that boat. And so you can't really tell. It's a figure, but I can't really distinguish who exactly that is. While it's day breaking, they don't recognize him. Jesus says to them in verse 5, children, do you have any fish? Of course, he knows the answer to it, doesn't he? And they say no. And so here it's interesting. Jesus, he responds to them when they say no, because they recognize their need. He says in verse 6, cast your nets on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. And so he responds, once they say no, he responds and tells them what they need. And they respond to that need. They go ahead and they cast it on the other side. And it says in verse 6, now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. And we know that there were so many fish that it talks about in verse 11 that there were 153 large fish. Now, I don't know how big a large fish is, but we're talking several hundreds of pounds here that he's hauling, that Peter's going to be hauling on shore. And that's just one of the nets. I don't know if they had more than one in this boat. So they had such a large net, a large haul of fish, they couldn't bring it in. And so you see Jesus, how he responds. And he gives them what they need and how they responded to their needs. They didn't just sit there and just say, no, I told you, we've already been fishing. We didn't catch anything. They listened to the Lord. And they recognized their need, which is the reason why they responded. And then in verse 7, it says, that disciple whom Jesus loved, that'd be John, therefore said to Peter, it's the Lord. Now, all of a sudden, you have to go back and you have to think about why would he recognize him then? Because this is a miraculous catch right here. All of a sudden, it takes you back to Luke 5, doesn't it? When they had a big boat full and a net full of fish that the net started breaking. It takes you back to that night of failure. And they just had another night of failure. It takes you back to all the fish they caught. The nets are breaking here. You have at least 153 large fish. The nets are breaking here. It says they're full. And so, man, can you imagine? They know that Jesus is alive because they saw his resurrected body, but they haven't seen him every day like they did when they were living with him. This would have been a special moment. This would have been a moment that every time they go fishing, they would have thought of that. And I would imagine that there that night, on that failure of a night of fishing, they would have been thinking, man, remember when Jesus was with us? Man, we got a whole boatload of fish then. Man, I wish he was here tonight. All those different memories that come back because that's the biggest, boatload of fish they ever had. And they left that cargo right there that could have made them a lot of money. They left there because one man said, follow me. And so they, I would imagine, are thinking about that night too. And so here, you see some points here that I think that need to be pointed out as they recognizing. And we need to recognize him. We need to recognize him. We need to believe in him. We need to confess him that he is God's son. It talks about in Romans chapter 10, 9 and 10, you confess him with your mouth and you believe in him. Those are things that are important for salvation. And they recognize the need that they had. And we need to recognize the need that we have. In Romans chapter 3, verse 23, we've all fallen short. We need to recognize that we need a Savior. We need him, and we need to recognize that it's him that we need. And the other thing is, we need others to recognize that he is in us. It talks about in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, it's no longer I live, but it's Christ that lives in me. That's what we need to realize, because I have crucified myself, and it's all about him. I pick up my cross daily and I follow him, as Luke chapter 9 talks about. So here in Acts chapter 4, verse 13, people recognized these apostles had spent time with Jesus. We need to be at that same point where people recognize that we spend time with Jesus. He is living in us. We're a peculiar people, as it talks about, a unique people. A people for his own possession, as it talks about in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. There should be a difference, the way we live, the way we react, as opposed to the way we respond. We should be responding to things instead of reacting. I was at a game, Brittany's game, and I saw some people reacting. And then I saw some people responding. And so you react with your emotions, you respond with your actions. And response is what needs to take place. You need to talk to her about the game. She's really good. So you see that morning of decision, failure, the next point under that is failure turns to success. You have a future turns to setback, and now you have a failure that turns to success, because now they have something special. They have Jesus with them. And this is not any other day. Because when Jesus is part of your day, it's an amazing thing. And in verse 7, John tells Peter, it's the Lord. And when Peter hears this in verse 7, that it was the Lord, he puts his garments on. And normally you don't put more on when you go swimming. He puts more on and he dives out. And that's amazing. In verse 8, it tells you how far he's swimming with all his clothes on. 100 yards. So I imagine the other disciples are probably thinking, oh, great, now he leaves us with the work. We got to haul these fish in. And here he is, he's diving out. You know, when you made a mistake, I know that there's certain kids at school, and when they make a mistake, I know one particular comes to my mind. When he makes a mistake, he always comes up to me. Hi, Mr. Todd. How are you doing, Mr. Todd? How are things going? You having a good day, Mr. Todd? And I know he's up to something. I know that young man has done something he shouldn't have been doing. And I know eventually I'm going to get a referral that's going to have that young man's name on it. And so I know something's happening. Well, that kind of makes me think about Peter. He's disappointed his friend, his Savior, and he wants to make it right. He wants to get close to Jesus. You think about the times in your life where you've messed up spiritually. You've done things you shouldn't have been doing. And you said things you shouldn't have been saying. And you just feel horrible and you want to make it right. And you want to get close to God. And so when different moments happen, all of a sudden we usually get on our knees and we start talking to God. That's when, if your attendance has been sparse, that's when you start worshiping him more. That's when you start taking him more serious, because you realize, man, I'm not right with God and I need to get right with him. I need to praise him the way he wants to be praised. I need to live the way he wants me to live. This is about him, because it's no longer I live, but Christ who lives in me, because I've been crucified with Christ. And so here, it kind of gives indication that he wants to get close to Jesus, because there's been a distance, there's been a void ever since that night when he looked straight at him and he denied him for the third time. And in verse 9, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, about 100 yards off. And when they got out of the boat, interesting, they saw a charcoal fire in place and fish laid on it and bread. So all of a sudden, by the time they're coming in, he's already got breakfast made. That seems to be kind of a miraculous thing, because he wasn't fishing. All of a sudden, he's got everything there. It doesn't talk about how he made the fire. It just seems like it's a miraculous fire that's taking place. And the whole thing, you've got all these fish. Couldn't catch before. Now you've got a net full. All these miraculous things. And then I would think, when Peter gets to shore, the last time there was a fire with Jesus was when he was warming his hands in John chapter 18 in that courtyard, and he was about to deny Jesus. All these things might have come flooding back to him. And in Luke 5, if you're talking about the similarities between 5 and verse 21, he said something there. He said, come follow me. I'll make you fishers of men. Here, he does something different. You see, in verse 10, it says that Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you've just caught. So Simon, that's when it says some of the fish. So it makes me think that he didn't bring them all. Maybe they had more than one net, because he brings a net ashore full of a large fish, 153 of them. That's a long, and then it says and although there were so many, the net was not torn. That seems to be, maybe that's another miraculous thing taking place that God's doing. We don't know, but it says in verse 12 that Jesus said, come, have breakfast. And now the disciples, they dared not ask who it was because they knew. You ever been in a situation where you're around some folks and you're kind of in on the conversation, you're not asking certain questions because you know the answer to them. They know exactly who they're talking to, but they don't want to say, who are you? Because they know he doesn't have to introduce himself. They already know who he is. There's people in this world that don't know who he is. They have to be introduced because we don't. We know who he is now. So we need to be the ones that introduce him to others. And in verse 13, it says, he came, took bread, gave thanks and gave it to them. And so with the fish. Now, this is the third time that he's revealed himself since he's been risen from the dead. So it didn't happen every day, as I mentioned. But then as they're eating, this is also interesting because he invited them to breakfast. And when Jesus invites you, you know the automatic response. It's not let me look at my calendar. Can you make it a different day? Can you make it another time? I think I've got, I want to sleep late. You don't make up excuses when he invites you. But he stands at the door knocking. In Revelation 3:20, he stands there knocking. And if we haven't obeyed Christ and we're not currently obeying Christ, then that means we're making excuses. I'm busy. There's something going on. Well, they didn't. When he invited them to breakfast, it was already planned. It was personal because he's inviting them. Well, he personally invites you. It says he calls us all by the gospel in 2 Thessalonians 2:14. So all of us are called by the same thing. His death, burial, and resurrection. He's saying, man, I want you. I'm doing everything I can to get you to be with me. And it was plentiful. They had all they needed. And so he invites them to breakfast. And he invites us too. He said for them to come. He tells us the same thing. In Matthew 11:28 and 30, he says, come. My burden's light. Come. And you lay your burdens on me. My yoke is easy. My burden is light. He's still inviting us. It's just, are we going to take the invitation? And so we see the similarities between Luke 5 and Luke 21, even some things that may have come up in Peter's mind, warming the fire and sitting around it. But then, if that didn't cause to jog his memory, verse 15 would start to do that. It says, and when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, it could have been that he means more than all these physical things you see. You got a big net full of fish, all these things. Or it could mean, do you mean love me more than these other disciples here, these other 6? Because after all, in Mark 14, you're the one that said, if they all fall away, I won't. And if I have to die with you, I will. So most likely it's probably saying, do you love me more than these 6? And so he says, it's a strongest form of love. And he says, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And this love, it means a great appreciation for, a deep appreciation. And so knowing this, or great affection, I should say, great affection or deep affection. So it's a different love that he's mentioning here. He says, do you love me with everything you've got? It's an unconditional thing. And he says, man, I have deep affection for you. And he tells him, feed my lamb. Or he says, verse 15, feed my lambs. And then, second time he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. Once again, it's 2 different types of love described in our English word. We only have one. But he says, do you love me with everything you got? This unconditional aspect, this sacrificial love. And he says, I have deep affection for you. And he says, tend my sheep. He gives them a different command there. First is feed my lambs. Take care of the young ones. Now he's saying take care of the mature ones. And the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you have deep affection for me? He changes the term and says, do you have deep affection for me? And he says, you know everything. You know I have deep affection for you. He says, feed my sheep. You're going to need to take care of them. And so you're going to need to look after them. Now, looking at all these different things here, it says he was hurt because it was mentioned 3 times. Now, I would imagine at this point, he kind of got the picture. I denied 3 times. Now I've got to confess my love 3 times. And, you know, it's kind of interesting to me. We have marriages. They'll get up here, wherever, and they'll make these vows. And they'll say, till death do us part. They'll talk about for better or worse, for richer or poorer, sickness, you know, and in health, all these things. I mean, these 2 people are up here and they're vowing before God and everybody else that I have unconditional love for you. But then we see so many marriages that split up and break up. And it just kind of comes down to the fact there is not unconditional love amongst us. There is a limit to our love. The reason I mention that is because you think about in this world, if your spouse cheated on you, all of a sudden there's a condition, isn't it? All of a sudden, your spouse is attacking you. Your spouse is hateful towards you. All of a sudden, there's some limits to love. You may stay married, but you may not love them. You may do it just out of commitment to God because he said there's only one way to get out of a marriage in Matthew 19 is adultery. And so all these different things, when that person is belittling you, intentionally trying to hurt you, not considering you, ignoring you, all of a sudden there's some changes. And this unconditional love really is not. There is a condition to this love. You're expecting the same thing in return, but there's one person that doesn't, and that's Jesus. He's the only one that has unconditional love. He's the only one that you can mistreat over and over again, and he still with open arms says, come. I'm standing at the door, and I'm still knocking. I still want to be with you. I'm still preparing a place for you. He's the only one. You cheat on him, and he's willing to take you back. There's one man that I knew, and his wife had cheated on him multiple times. And I had a conversation with him, and she was not a very nice lady. She was a very difficult lady anyway. And she had done these things. And so I went to my friend. I said, well, what are you going to do? And he said, well, I've got kids. I don't want to make the decision because of them. But I know that Christ would want me to work this out. Because the love that he's shown me when I've been unfaithful to him. Now that just blows my mind. He ends up working it out with this lady who's not a very nice lady. I'm telling you, not very nice. And all of a sudden, a few years later, I was asking him, you don't ask every day, hey, how's it going? I asked him a little bit later how it was going. And he said, it's amazing. She is the wife that I've always wanted. She's not doing those things that she was doing before as far as not being very nice. And she's totally focused on him. She's not looking at other men. I mean, it's just him. And he's saying she's everything I wanted. She is the spouse that I have prayed for. And you think about that, and you think the only way that happened is he was showing her the kind of love that he got from God, the kind of love he got from Christ, who's dying on the cross, knowing all the things that we're going to be doing. And he still says, I love you. I would do it again because I love you that much. And I don't ever stop wanting you to be with me. The only time it's done is when you breathe your last. Because he wants you. He wants you the way you are, but he wants you to change. He wants you to repent. That's why it talks about in Luke chapter 13, 3 and 4, you're commanded to repent, to change your life. It talks about that again in Acts chapter 2, verse 38. You can't keep living your way and be with Christ. But he is willing to take you scabs, warts, and all, scars, and heal you. He's able to remove all those things. There's no one like it because he's the only one that has unconditional love. There's a limit to mine, but there's not to his. And it's amazing. And who wouldn't want to experience that? This chapter, forgive me for getting emotional on it, but this chapter is all about Jesus' unconditional love. And he shows Peter, from this moment on, we don't hear about him going fishing for fish. We hear about him going fishing for men. At this point on, he is focused, he is dialed in, and never again does he deny Jesus. When you experience that kind of love, how can you ever be the same? And how do you find that? You find it from reading the scriptures. You fall in love with Jesus the more you get to read about him, the more you get to see. He's got an unconditional love that's no matter. There was a story that some of you guys know, Monica, that was here a couple weeks ago. And we were talking on the phone, and she said, I've got an 11th hour Christian story for you. I was like, oh man, I want to hear that. And so there's this lady, her name's Tammy. She's married to Michael, another Michael here. And so Michael's parents are faithful, and Michael was not. And then his wife was diagnosed with a disease, and all of a sudden, I don't know if that's what caused, but all of a sudden he started becoming more faithful to God. His life started changing. And his wife is not a Christian. And eventually, they can't do anything. She's got to have a new liver. They can't do anything. And that's not going to take place in time. And so she's put in hospice. And her husband's folks are studying with her. They're talking with her. And at this point, she can't even, she's wheelchair bound. So she's limited on what she can do. And she's in the hospital, and it's just kind of one of those, just a matter of time. And she decides to put Christ on a baptism because she read from her Bible what Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4 talk about. That once you're baptized, you get a new start. You get a new life. And who wants to be trapped in that body that's dying? And she read that in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, that if she's baptized and she changes her life, she repents and she's baptized, then all those sins that she has done in her whole entire life are wiped away and forgotten. And she read in Mark chapter 16, verse 16, that if she believes in him and is baptized, she's saved. She didn't have to worry about doctors saving her. She wanted to be baptized. She believed in him. She repented because of him, and she wanted to be baptized into him. So it took a little time, a little wrangling at the hospital. I don't know if it was the burn unit, but they eventually got a pool of water, and she was immersed in water for salvation. And she was a Christian 2 days. And in paradise today. An amazing thing. We've got an opportunity today. We may not have it tomorrow, but we've got it today. And so this moment's all we have. And so he tells them, feed my sheep. But what's also interesting, in that last bit of chapter 21, verse 19, he says something very similar that he does in Luke chapter 5. And after saying this to him, he tells Peter, follow me. That's it. That's the same thing. And it's what he's asking for us to do. Just follow him. Don't have to listen to all these different people. Mark chapter 9 talks about just listen to my son. If you were going to listen to anybody, just listen to him. Don't listen to me. If I'm saying something different, you better look at God's word and see if it measures up. You got to listen to him. Don't listen to the commentators. Don't listen to the news. Don't listen to your friends, your family, the church leaders. Listen to Jesus. And your life will forever be changed because you'll be growing closer to the one, the only one that has unconditional love for you. Whatever you need, please come while we stand and sing.